Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my podcast. This is the second episode, and I'm absolutely excited because today I have a lot of things I want to talk about, honestly. And today I'm going to need y'all to match my social media freak, okay? Because we're going to be talking about Twitter, X, whatever you like to call the platform. And we're going to go a little bit down the rabbit hole with me of what I would have liked to see happen with Twitter. So I get really excited learning about platforms and talking about and just taking a deep dive. I fall down that rabbit hole quite a bit because I'm very interested not just in how the platforms work public facing and how creating posts work and things like that, but I love learning how they were created and how they have transitioned over time, what features and things like that, because it really gives you a great perspective on not just when you're creating content, but it tells you more about the platform itself and the things that you'll see and the things that you can expect and lean into. So let's back it up. What is Twitter? So Twitter is a social media platform that started as a text-based platform in 2006. It was created by Jack Dorsey, Biz Stone, Noah Glass, and Evan Williams. And it basically was a part of Odeo, which was I think it was like an audio podcasting company before it spun off to become its own thing. And the way Twitter started, there was a lot of conflict in terms of how to define Twitter of what it was going to be. I think Jack Dorsey wanted it to be more of a status updated, what are you doing? Sharing with your friends and wanting to connect that way. But it honestly took on a life of its own. Twitter became like the water cooler app of social media, basically. People would not just share, obviously, their status. They would talk about current events. They would talk about natural disasters. I mean, there were so many things that just started coming up, and it just created its own culture. People started using hashtags to categorize the content, which some of the Twitter staff was apparently against. They didn't think people were that nerdy and wanted to use hashtags, but that's exactly what happened, and it blew up. I mean, it's how things are still categorized with Twitter today. It's how trends were tracked and how they were started with Twitter. And I can't imagine it without it, to be honest with you. But anyway, it was focused on short text and short videos. But again, it absolutely exploded. Fast forward to 2021, 2022, Twitter had all of these expansions that they had been wanting to do. They wanted to create an edit button. They wanted longer tweets. They wanted to combat more of the fake accounts and bots. They wanted like crypto and Bitcoin integration. They wanted to open source their algorithm. They wanted decentralization. These planned expansions obviously came to a halt when Elon Musk bought Twitter in 2022 for $44 billion. And he decided to take it in a completely different route, unfortunately. Elon wanted to make Twitter X, he wanted to make it a super app like WeChat or Alipay. And personally, it wasn't a good move. This wasn't the first time that he tried to do this, and I think he should have learned his lesson personally. But again, just my opinion. Twitter was never meant to be a financial app whatsoever. Yes, they were talking about crypto and Bitcoin integration and things like that, but a lot of these apps that are based in America, that are even based in North America, we are big fans of, first of all, decentralization. We do not want one app that does everything. Even right now, Meta's on trial for having obviously Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp because they're cornering the market. And the question is, can they have that much power, and can one company have that much power and control? And we're talking about 3 different social media apps that lean into different things. But basically, there were so many things Elon Musk, I don't think, took into account, which I think is incredibly interesting with him being South African. I'll explain. Because in countries, if you're comparing, obviously, America to countries like China or, say, Nigeria, which is a country in Africa, they skipped the PC era, leapfrogged it, basically. There were a lot of people that were unbanked. There wasn't a ton of trust in banks. There wasn't a ton of access. And they basically both became a mobile first economy. And so that's how a lot of things were built. If we're talking about China, let's talk about like WeChat or Alipay. Basically, they became these super apps because they started with banking or they started with messaging and expanded to have different functions. And that was just a part of the infrastructure. And one thing about China, and similarly, I want to say about Nigeria, again, there are still some differences, but in terms of those trends overall, I think they're similar to each other. But there wasn't as much regulation in terms of these big companies owning these platforms and expanding. And so we get Tencent. Tencent is a massive, massive, massive multinational conglomerate. And if you haven't heard of Tencent, I'm sure you've heard of their products. So Tencent owns everything from venture capital, e-commerce, what else? There's platforms, mobile games, web portals, internet services, payment systems, smartphones, all of that kind of stuff. This is also one of the largest gaming companies. If you play games on PC, we're talking League of Legends. If you play on mobile, PUBG. And if you're a fan of C-dramas, like Love, Game, and Eastern Fantasy, The King's Avatar, or one of my favorite, Falling Into Your Smile, all produced by Tencent. So the other thing is China's not the only country that shifted towards mobile banking and multifunction apps. This is also prominent in countries in Africa, like Nigeria. They have a mobile banking app called Pesa. And again, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, in South Africa, where Elon is from, have apps like VodaPay, Moya app, Avo, which is also called, I think, Nedbank. Again, multifunction super apps. And Nigeria and South Africa aren't the only countries that mirror China's leapfrog over the PC era into mobile first, because they also have, again, it was a similar issue, not trying to say it's the exact same issue, but again, there are a lot of similarities in terms of how that transition happened. They had a lot of people who were unbanked. Not a lot of people had access to internet in places like Nigeria and South Africa. And mobile devices were a much cheaper and more accessible option for most people to be able to access that. So instead of having obviously traditional brick and mortar banks, they were able to access mobile banking, and it just made sense. But again, this is how their digital economy was shaped versus in America, where we did have that PC era boom where people actually had their own personal computers, and then leaning more into mobile devices, smartphones that we have now. And I'm really surprised Elon didn't take note being from South Africa. That just seems really weird to want to create this app with a foundation that doesn't actually work with the user base you're trying to build it for. No, Twitter is not only for North American users. Obviously, it's for people around the world, and international users use it. However, being a sort of Western world focused app first, it just didn't make sense. That's the take he had. And he wanted to take this platform that was never had the foundation for it, to go that way. And I think that's another one of the reasons, besides obviously alienating shareholders and everything else that's been going on and losing ad revenue. I mean, it just seemed like the wrong take of what to do when you take ownership of a platform that had so much potential. So one of my favorite features that Twitter ever did was called Spaces. Spaces is basically an audio chat room. And I just thought it was just a really cool idea when it first rolled out. But let's rewind. Let's take it back to 2015. Because before Twitter Spaces was created, they were doing Blue Rooms. And they did a Blue Room with a K-pop group called GOT7. And the reason this is important is because some Agassi's credit this conversation that two of the founders had with GOT7 with part of the ideation of creating Twitter Spaces. And while we don't know for sure if it is the reason Twitter Spaces was created, we definitely can tell, especially from the way Jack Dorsey mentions how K-pop stans have helped boost the platform in the past and how it helped really shape Twitter, that this conversation definitely had an influence on that feature. So anyway, in 2015, Jack Dorsey and Biz Stone were sitting with some of the members of GOT7, and they were asking them, how do they use the platform? What features would they like to see? Having that kind of conversation. And Young Jay stated that they use it for Q&As to tweet with fans and engage and have conversation. And he expressed wanting to have an audio chat room where they'd be able to talk with fans directly. And Bam Bam also mentioned if Twitter could have a dark mode. At the time, Twitter had a dim setting, but did not have a dark mode. I think they later added a dark mode in 2019. Okay, so talking about Twitter Spaces leads me right into what I would have liked to see for the platform. Whether Elon had taken it over or not, these are just my ideas of what I would have loved to see the platform do. It's so, in terms of Twitter, not just like monetizing, but really opening up the space and being more creative, I think they should have done something similar to Instagram and lean towards creatives, but instead of leaning towards video, because I don't think they would have beat them in that avenue or been able to compete enough in that avenue. I honestly think Twitter has its own ecosystem and its own user expectations, with it being primarily a text-based platform and then photos and then short videos. But I think leading into text and audio, I think is what Twitter really should have done in terms of supporting creatives. I think, so starting with Twitter Spaces or X Spaces, because they do still exist now. I don't use X Spaces, to be honest with you. I did use Twitter Spaces, but yeah, I'm not a big fan of X Spaces because quite a few things have changed. Although they did add a few things, there are ticketed events, which I do think they should have added. But I would have loved to see like virtual book readings. I would have loved to see not just, they could do like paid Q&A sessions, exclusive performance sets and things like that. It seemed like such an easy leeway to what they were already working on. Another thing I would have liked to see would have been creator subscription tiers. So I don't know if they still have subscription tiers for users, but I would like to have seen creator subscription tiers where creators are able to monetize, because I think that would have made more sense versus the blue check mark and all the other kind of stuff that they kept trying to do with the accounts when Elon first took it over. Again, it would have been really cool because they could have provided like exclusive content, early access. Like there could have been all of these things that would have just really made sense. I would have loved to see more like interactive tools for their spaces, not just polls or like Q&As or anything like that, but like whiteboards and collaborative whiteboards and stuff like that. I think that would have and playback. I think that would have just made more sense on that platform. I think something really cool they could have done, because they leaned into audio, is having audio first creator tools. And I think it would have been really cool to have maybe like a third-party developer create tools and create ways to actually measure what's happening in terms of actually having like the analytics, the dashboards, audience segmentation, but being clear about how data was used, data privacy, and how users could opt in and out, and what information they would be willing to share and agree to share or not share. I think would have been really interesting. And I think if Twitter could have taken that, it would have been a different avenue for creators. But I think the other thing is, in terms of creators, it wouldn't have just been for audio first. It could have also been for like writers, poets, designers, webtoon artists. I think there's so much more they could lean into. The second thing I think I would have loved to see happen would have been them leaning into their international like following. One thing I think Twitter, despite whether you like the platform or not, one thing Twitter does really well is that it has a large international following. Even after all of the politics in the US and everything else going on, it has consistently kept a large international following on the platform. And I keep saying international because there's obviously been a drop in North American users, or based off of the last reports that we've been able to kind of get, I guess. I don't know. There's been a lot of mixed reports since the Elon has taken over. A lot of the integrations don't really work anymore. And so we're not sure what metrics to use. How can you define like how many users are on the platform? Are these numbers correct? It's just very hard to decipher because a lot of it is no longer as transparent as it was in the past. But anyway, Twitter has a large international following. And one thing I did notice personally is when large events started to happen, for example, when the president of South Korea declared martial law and the people were able to mobilize, the first place I actually saw that hit my social media or that I heard anything about it was on Twitter, actually. A lot of the people were using Twitter to not just keep a record of what was happening, but to inform people, not just obviously other citizens, but around the world of what was happening. So we really got a up close and personal view of what was happening. And Twitter did a really good job of that because the citizens were utilizing Twitter as the medium to get that message out and to shape that narrative, which I thought was really cool. But anyway, because of the large international following that Twitter has, especially for if you're talking like music, entertainment, you're talking, again, actors, all that kind of stuff, that's something Twitter should lean into. There is a huge following of as fans from different countries, but specifically, if you look, there's like a huge following of like K-pop and C-pop stans and K-drama and C-drama and all that kind of stuff. And you see that take over Twitter. Like you still see that these hashtags are trending for different actors and musicians. And I mean, you still see, what's an example? Recently, there have been hashtags for GOT7 when they had their comeback when they had their concert in Thailand. And one of GOT7's members, Bam Bam, he used the platform. I think it was last year. He was asking his followers for ideas for his outfits for his tour or something like that. And they were designing outfits. And I think he actually picked one that he actually used, which is awesome. But just the level of engagement was off the charts. And not being able to lean into that just doesn't make sense as a company. I would have loved to see Twitter create like regional creator programs and localized content and curation instead of some kind of one size fits all approach. There's so much like diversity in the world, and there's so much diversity in Twitter that it just doesn't make sense that you wouldn't lean into that, especially since that's, again, been one of their bases from the beginning of how Twitter was able to gain more traction. And Jack Dorsey even actually mentions this several times in interviews. So yeah, in terms of leaning into the international following, creating regional creator programs and localized curated content, multilingual support. Twitter has, again, people from all over the world writing in different languages. And A, it doesn't always translate, but B, having real-time translation, not just for tweets, but for Twitter Spaces, I think would have been such a cool way for them to lean into that. Obviously, more people could communicate and more people would want to use the platform and they could learn about what's happening everywhere else. And it just makes sense. Like if you've got all these users speaking all these languages and you want people to understand, you'd want them to be able to communicate. And translation just makes sense. One more thing that they could have leaned into in terms of like their international following is in terms of payment infrastructure. I think in terms of expanding payment options and local currency support, I think I'm not sure where X is at this point, but having monetization features for a global audience would just make sense in terms of leaning into that international following. And I would really love to see them really expand and really build that up. Okay. And the next thing I want to talk about is creating more ways for just diverse creatives to monetize on Twitter. I saw so much potential in when you look at Twitter and say someone was telling a story, right? You could take several tweets and you could make a thread and you were able to follow this story along. And it reminded me of when I was in middle school, a friend of mine she was writing a book, and every so many weeks she'd have a chapter and she'd print it out and she'd let the whole grade read it. And then she'd have a place at the end where we could leave like comments and feedback, stuff like that. And it just reminded me of that sort of feel, but not necessarily like it doesn't have to necessarily be feedback, but in terms of being able to have that personal connection and that kind of like personal communication and engagement just makes so much more sense on Twitter, where you can leverage that visibility and monetize it if you're a creator. So I'm not talking just, again, we aren't talking just authors, not just like musicians and actors and actresses doing like ticketed Twitter spaces, but I'm talking authors, poets, script writers, comedians, short story writers, just all of that. Like, designers and cartoonists, webtoon authors and things like that. I think Twitter could have leaned into that and created a space for them and built a platform to help them monetize. And it would have also built their company up as well. And it just doesn't make sense that you had this text-based, audio-based platform where you could have built these subscription models that just made so much more sense. Because I think about apps like Webtoon or Fable, where you can join, obviously, like book clubs, but there could be, like, your favorite author could give like a sneak preview of like their first chapter of their new book or something they're working on if they wanted to. And there could be, in terms of Webtoon artists, like Twitter, I personally think Twitter could have competed with like Wattpad and Webtoons. I think they could have created a space for those creators to build more visibility and to be able to showcase their portfolio on Twitter. And I think that would have been really cool for them to be able to build that out. The fourth thing I would have loved Twitter to be able to do is API integration. I think there was so much potential that was just lost in the mix. So if you don't know, API stands for Application Process Interface. And basically, it boils down to programs being able to talk to each other and share data. That's the easiest way to explain it. An example that social media managers might understand is if there's an API integration from Metricool to one of the social media apps, like for Twitter, for example, which there is, but there isn't. It no longer really shares much data. Twitter has changed how they share their metrics and what kind of metrics that they use. So you don't get a ton of useful metrics from Twitter anymore for the API integration with Metricool. In terms of creating ARP integrations, Twitter could have created more robust and stable APIs. Basically, under Elon Musk, he alienated developers. But I think had that been really leaned into, I think Twitter could have done so much more. There could have been creator-centric API where they bring in third-party developers to build out these dashboards, analytic tools, and creator tools for Twitter. And I think it would have been absolutely amazing in terms of that, to build that sort of collaborative tech space, because I think that's the way Twitter should have gone, and just my personal opinion. Just thinking about companies like Adobe, Notion, Procreate, Twitter could have had all of these like partnership collaborations and built these developer tools and built out with all of these different companies in terms of leaning in with creators, and it would just make sense. And I think one thing that people take for granted is that social media shapes all of these narratives. Like, I know we're talking again about what I would have loved to see with Twitter, but again, I would love to see all of that happen, which, is just in my wildest dreams. I don't think it will ever happen, but it's something I just kind of wanted to put out there. But in terms of shaping narratives, I couldn't shake this thought. There is a book that I've been reading lately called We Tried to Tell Y'all by Meredith C. Clark. And it's about Black Twitter and the rise of digital counter narratives. And in this book, Meredith talks about how the women of Black Twitter, she talks about the history of Black Twitter, and she talks about the women of Black Twitter and how they were able to use the platform to combat mischaracterization of Black life in mainstream media. She goes through a lot of different examples of how it's done, like the hashtag Black Girl Magic and all that kind of stuff. But again, just one simple way that social media has shaped narratives, honestly, and is shaping history. And again, I would have loved to see Twitter do all these things, or X. I know that's not quite where it is at this point, but that's just what I think. But thanks for coming with me on this little journey, taking the time to match my freak for a minute and letting me do my deep dive of what I would have loved to see for Twitter. But again, I will leave all the links in the comments for all the references that I have made so that you'll be able to check it out more for yourselves. And you can tell me what you think, but also check out that book as well. We Tried to Tell Y'all by Meredith C. Clark. I highly recommend. I haven't finished reading. I'm almost done. But once I do, I will do a video for it. So anyway, that's that. So thanks for vibing with me. Okay, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Of course, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'll have the podcast also on Spotify. And then you can follow on social media at Kiss My Analytics. You can follow us on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Facebook. So see you next time.